Chapter 45. Syrruk Prime was a shadow, a blot of black ink on a black page. It was so dark that even the holographic display was having difficulty finding its shape and edges. It was not round. It was also not what had set off their proximity alert. Moving diamond forms, dark like the shadow they came from, whooshed past the Red Robert, and the small ship shuddered. There had been three in as many seconds. "What are they?" Petrick asked. In his customary side seat, Colossus crunched out some response that Balta translated. "Ships," she said. "Syrruk, I'd guess." "You don't know?" Haber asked. Petrick stole a glance at the android, and Haber looked back wordlessly, attentively, like he would have before. He was his usual self. He didn't remember. "I've never been to Syrruk, android," Balta growled, "and neither has anyone else that I've ever known." "Where are they going, then?" Barry wondered. He then crunched delightedly into a munchin strip. Apparently breakfast had been served, at least in part. "Very good question." There was apprehension in the pirate captain's voice. Susie seized upon it. "You think they're not friendly?" "There are rumors," Balta continued. "Fringe encounters. Super religious, they say. Appear and disappear. Can read your mind and tell the future, mumbo-jumbo like that. But no one's ever been to Syrruk Prime, at least who's ever lived to tell anyone about it." Another diamond shape slid past them, 20 or 30 times their size, and completely dark. "No one except my father," Petrick said. Balta nodded. As she did, the heads-up display on the cockpit clicked green, and a new graphic was displayed. Like the path they had seen plotted through the rock fields of the wall, this one lit up in oranges and yellows, leading towards Syrruk Prime. "Looks like they've rolled out the welcome mat," Balta said with unabashed surprise. She shook her head and rubbed the sweat from her brow. "Oh, hell," she muttered to herself. She grunted and punched some controls, and the Red Robert surged forward to where the lit-up path pointed them. Slowly, the Red Robert floated toward the dark planet. They were alone now. Gone were the dozen or so diamond ships. As they neared, small pinpricks of light appeared dotting the rough surface. Ragged was indeed an apt word, for as they neared, they realized why Syrruk's shadow was so hard to define. Syrruk was more a fragment than a planet. It had been hollowed out like a worm-ridden apple. There were too many tunnel holes to count, and then cracked apart. Shards the size of continents had split and broken free, as its gravitational forces had inevitably weakened with the diminishing mass. These chunks floated lazily close to the remaining portion, giving a vague idea of the sphere it had once been. "What happened?" Barry asked. "Why does this planet look so weird?" "Starstuff mining is what happened," Balta said knowingly. She'd seen this before. "This is what a wandering giant looks like when it's been sucked of its starstuff ore." "It looks like it's rotting," Susie said. "Yeah, that's about right," Balta grunted. "With all the mass that's removed, the crust of the planet starts to collapse inward, or just break off like those pieces." She pointed to the floating splinters. "You think the authority has been here?" Haber asked. "I don't know. Someone has." "Maybe that's why they're so private," Barry said. He was nodding his head sagely, as if he fancied he and the Syrruk might have something in common. Silently, the dark world filled their view in every direction, blotting out the stars as far as they could see. Somehow, without those friendly pins of light, it felt as if the Red Robert were falling into some deep, dark hole with no bottom. Vertigo filled Petrick, so he tried to focus on the heads-up instead, which showed them sloping obediently downward on the vector they'd received. As they drew closer to the black shadow, blips of light began to appear on the surface. They were small domes, lit up and dotting the rocky, atmosphereless surface like tents. They were miles apart from each other. Had they always been there, too small to see from a distant orbit? Or had they just appeared? "I wonder what they are," Susie said as they flew over. "They're in, like, giant circles or something." She was right. They were. Concentric circles spread out over hundreds of miles, ringing an amorphous center, which was directly where the Red Robert was heading. But there was nothing to be seen ahead, just darkness ringed by the glowing tents. Balta switched on their landing lights as they neared the surface, and their bright spots pierced through the inky black to reveal a pebbled and dusty surface. They were heading toward a mountain range, or at least what used to be one. Its tips had been stripped layer by layer down to rubble. They couldn't see any sign of life or civilization, but the cockpit's overlay insisted that they continue forward, straight toward the largest remaining peak of the once great mountain range. Closer and closer they came until even the shambles of the mountain peak towered above them, and still no landing site presented itself. No figures pointed the way. Captain, Barry said from the back, why is that hologram telling us to fly into the mountain? I'm not sure. Balta was busy scanning her instruments, also doubting these landing instructions they'd been given. Was this what the Syrruk did? Give phony landing vectors to trusting ships and smash them upon their lightless rocks? Just as Balta was about to let her suspicions override any small semblance of trust, shut their thrusters down, and just park on the nearest flat piece of land, a vertical beam of light appeared out of solid rock directly ahead of them. Everyone in the cockpit raised their hands and arms to cover their suddenly blinded eyes, and the line of light began to expand across their faces, growing wider. Once their eyes adjusted, there were gasps from the children and dropped jaws from the adults. The mountain itself was rumbling open. 2 massive doors, hewn from the rock, were parting to let them inside. Beyond the stone door was an enormous chamber, a hangar. Petrick had seen 2 others now. He knew how they looked. Well, breathed Barry, that was neat. The Red Robert flew into the cavern, and everyone twisted their necks to look around. As one would expect of a ship hangar in the middle of a mountain, it appeared to have been blasted straight from the rock of Syrruk Prime. Floodlights poured from the back far wall, where they could make out several person-sized doorways. No figures, however. The Syrruk themselves were nowhere to be seen. Barry pointed at several small diamond-shaped vehicles on either wall to the sides. They were matte black and seemed to suck in the passing light of the Red Robert's landing gear. They were smallish, with a single-person cockpit centered in the front of each vessel. They were sharp and aggressive-looking. They look like the larger ships we passed on our way in, Haber observed astutely. Fighters, Balta said with confidence. Then, maybe? Where is everyone? Susie asked. Did they all leave? Balta set the Red Robert down with a practiced clunk, and Petrick heard the winding down of the terrestrial thrusters. Outside, it was quiet. The seat harness released Balta with a click-click, and she rose and loosened her arms and legs with a stretch. Let's find out. The gangplank had hardly hit the ground when Balta had the exterior hatch open, her 2 golden guns ready at her sides, and she began crouch-walking out into the hangar. The air was surprisingly fresh, like stones washed in a creek bed. Petrick had expected it to smell stale, musty, and otherwise ancient, because the chamber looked ancient. The walls of the hangar rose far above what the lights could show them, but Petrick noticed they sloped inward. It reminded him that he was standing inside a mountain. Inside a mountain. It also made him think that this hangar was really a microcosm of Syrruk Prime itself, a hollowed-out shell. Petrick tentatively set down Clark, and his nails went tick-tick-tick on the matte black stone floor as he stuck close to his master. It was deathly quiet. Hello? Susie's voice echoed around the chamber like a chorus, and Balta jumped. Susie, she said. She gestured to the guns in her hands. You want me to shoot you? Someone has to be here, she responded. They opened the door for us, didn't they? Next time, give me a warning before shouting in my ear. I'm just trying not to waste anyone's time. Perhaps it would be best to let Captain Balta lead the way, Haber said, inserting himself into the argument. Susie grunted and made a bowing gesture for Balta to continue. Where to? She asked her, knowing full well she had no idea. I'd bet my dinner we need to go through those doors over there. Barry pointed to the back wall of the hangar. Underneath the powerful spotlights, shining out beyond the hangar, were several closed stone doors, just slightly larger than one would expect for humans. They, too, were diamond-shaped, perhaps 9 feet tall and 6 feet wide. The Syrruk clearly had a favorite shape. Balta and Haber looked at each other and shared a quick glance that said, "Might as well," and they all started slowly stalking in that direction. They were tense, coiled. Even Haber looked ready for anything. Another sound made Balta jump, along with Barry and Petrick, but this time it wasn't Susie. It was one of the doors sliding open with the distinct sound of grinding rock. Balta pointed her guns toward the door. A backlit figure stepped into the frame. It was tall, too tall, in fact, taller even than Haber. Otherwise, it looked human, albeit with exaggerated shapes here and there at the joints and torso. It was holding a staff of some kind. Balta signaled for the group to freeze, which was unnecessary because they had already. The figure stepped toward them, and the backlighting adjusted enough for them to see that the exaggerated shapes came from the full-body armor the figure was wearing. It was sleek, and the same matte jet black as all the other Syrruk technology they'd seen so far, including a wraparound helmet. Everything was dark, impenetrable, except for the staff the figure carried. The staff glittered in the darkness. It was covered with jewel-like crystals of various brilliant colors, inlaid into the black material that formed the shaft. The shaft supported a large diamond-shaped tip, which glowed a bright, swirling golden color. Petrick knew the color instantly, and he also remembered where he had seen the multicolored crystals on the staff's shaft, though the ones he'd seen had been much, much smaller. "Captain," he asked Balta as the figure stepped purposefully toward them, "you said the Syrruk were religious. What is it they worship?" "Starstuff," said Balta, not taking her eyes off the figure, which was now 300 feet or so away from them. It was the answer Petrick had expected. He'd seen that kind of crystal in Balta's Starstuff ore canisters. Once the figure stood about 10 paces from the group, Balta cleared her throat and stepped forward, brandishing her guns for the Syrruk to see. "Stop right there," she said, in a much lower voice than Petrick had ever heard her use before. It caused the pirate captain to, tragically, cough immediately. The figure stopped, tapping its staff down with emphasis. "Welcome to Syrruk, outsiders," said a voice of silk that sounded like it was coming directly from inside Petrick's ear. Haber stepped forward, surprised. "You speak inter-system standard," she said, "and you've tapped directly into my internal auditory processing." Oh, sorry, that was Haber. Let's read that again. Haber stepped forward, surprised. "You speak inter-system standard," he said, "and you've tapped directly into my internal auditory processing." It sounded like he was speaking directly into my ear, too, Petrick said. "Me too," said Susie, "and it didn't sound like a he. It sounded like a she." "Mind telling me if you're friend or foe?" Balta asked of their greeter, warily waving her guns again. "We're Barry, Susie, and Petrick of Mother Indikar," Barry piped, "and we're friendly. Haber and Clark, too." He pointed at Haber and then Clark, who, on cue, let out a small growl and raised the hair on the back of his neck. "And that's Balta. She's nice, too, promise." "We know who you are," the silk voice responded, and Petrick had to agree with Susie. It did sound like a woman's voice. The group looked at each other after the bold proclamation by the Syrruk envoy. They knew who they were? "May I ask how that is possible?" said Haber. "The Seer wishes to speak with you, Petrick of Indikar," the voice answered, and she pointed directly at Petrick. "You must follow me." The figure made an about face and began to march swiftly toward the still open door at the back of the hangar. She meant for them to follow. "Quickly," she added. Petrick started walking, and before anyone could protest, he said, "You guys stay here. I'll be fine." "Oh, no, you don't," Susie called after him, and hustled up to walk at his side. "If you're going in there, we're going with you." "No, really," Petrick said, trying to speed up and leave her behind. The rest of the group was also now following. "Master Petrick," Haber called up to them, I have to agree with young Master Susie. It would be safer for you guys to stay here. Petrick stopped, and so did Susie. Despite his sharp words, she was undeterred. She folded her arms and glared at him. Let the grown-ups worry about safe, kid, Balta growled as she, Haber, and Barry rejoined them. But they only asked for me. Did you wake up funny? Susie asked. She bonked him on the top of his head. We stick together. I'm sure Tall Suit up there wouldn't mind. Petrick was about to indicate he didn't agree when the silk voice was back in their ears, impatient. Your companions are requested as well, Petrick of Indikar. See? Susie was triumphant. Petrick slumped and nodded his head. He knew it would be this way. Why had he tried to fight it? We must depart, said their host. We are expected. That's the end of chapter 45. Okay, guys, looks like we're still doing good, which is excellent news. Okay. Chapter 46. So, she's an alien? Barry whispered as they were led down the halls deep into the Syrruk Mountain. Petrick was sure he meant to be quiet enough not to be heard, but he was also sure, just from the vibrations their footsteps were sending down the echoing hall, that their host could hear him quite well if she wished. Susie glared at him. What? Barry put his hands up to defend himself. Maybe she doesn't like that word, Susie whispered back. We don't know what the Syrruk are, Balta said from the side of her mouth. But I doubt they like people talking about them behind their backs. That zipped Barry up and Susie too. The hallways were black and shiny, in contrast to the matte finish on everything else they'd seen, and here and there Starstuff ore crystals glittered in the light, which seemed to mostly be coming from a doorway at the far end. Their guide was leading them to it as swiftly as she could, pausing now and then to let the smaller legs catch up to the pace. Petrick looked at the black suit their host wore. It fit tightly in places and angled into edges and exaggerated points in others, which made it impossible to guess at her shape beyond 2 legs, 2 arms, a head, generally like a human. There wasn't a single spot of bare skin anywhere, so that too was a mystery. Most mysterious of all was the completely opaque helmet, which was matte and light-absorbing everywhere except a glistening slit in the front where Petrick assumed her eyes must be. Did she have 2, like he did? Did she have a nose? A mouth? How alien was she? What was her... My name is Panzer, she said once they reached the doorway at the end of the long hall. I am Chief Centurion of the Seer's Guard. She said it with the shiny slit pointed to Petrick, as if she'd heard his question before he could speak it, before he even knew he was going to think it, which he realized he'd been about to. She motioned for the fivesome, plus Clark, to enter the small room beyond the door. They hesitated. She sighed audibly and passed through first, then gestured again for them to follow, as if to say, it's safe. In the room, there were several shapes on the floor, diamonds, of course, marked in matte black that stood out from the otherwise shiny blackness. Panzer stood on one of the shapes, and the rest of the group intuited that they should do the same. Panzer kneeled once the group was in place, and the moment her back knee hit the floor, the whole room lit up in bright gold. Petrick reflexively clutched at Clark, who was in his arms, and he realized the dog's fur was standing on end. A high-pitched whine filled the room. Petrick looked at Panzer and saw that she was holding her staff above her head turned up toward the sky, or ceiling, as it was. The high-pitched whine increased sharply in intensity, which made Petrick wince in pain, and then there was pitch darkness and silence. What in the far-flung galaxy was that? Balta said into the darkness. Is everyone okay? Haber asked. A golden light appeared and brightened slowly, and Petrick saw that Panzer was getting back up to her feet. Susie was standing, as were Haber, Balta, and Barry. They were fine. He was fine. He realized that his skin was tingling all over. Even his insides tingled. Praise be to the Timeless, Panzer said, and she turned to the back of the chamber. Petrick was about to point out that the door they'd entered through was actually in the other direction when the wall she was facing slid open and a new blinding light poured in. Panzer stepped through the doorway, and the group followed her. "You're not much for explanations, are you, lady?" Balta called after her. Whatever follow-up admonition she had for her was swallowed by the expanse that opened up before them beyond the door. Balta's eyes went wide, and her breath caught in her chest. "My stars," she said. They were standing on a ledge of some kind that was perched 100 feet or so above the floor of... Excuse me, sorry. I'm going to have to take a drink of water. Let's back that up a little bit. They were standing on a ledge of some kind that was perched 100 feet or so above the floor of an enormous cavern. It was a cavern the size of, well, the size of a mountain. It stretched out for miles in every direction and funneled up from the sides toward a peak miles above them. It was hard to say exactly how high it reached because an enormous blue-white light floated near the top, its form obscured because it was too bright to look at directly. "It's incredible!" Barry whooped. His voice echoed out into the cavern. The floor of the city-sized cavern was covered in rolling green fields, dotted with modest houses and larger clusters of buildings here and there. It looked like a city inside a mountain, but something was off. "Where is everyone?" Balta asked. "There's nobody here." But Petrick realized she was right. As vast and overwhelming as the chamber was, there was not a single person to be seen other than themselves, and it was eerily quiet. "By directive from the Seer, we have sent our mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers away from here," Panzer answered in a clipped tone. Before anyone could ask a follow-up to such a statement, Panzer tapped a small button on the wrist of her suit. Without any other warning, 7 figures appeared seemingly out of thin air on the ledge and formed a half-circle around the group. They were all wearing the same impressive black suits as Panzer, sans staff. They were all as big as she was, and they were all crouched threateningly. "Hey!" Balta barked, reaching for her holstered guns. "Do not fear, Starfarer," Panzer said with the same clipped tone, and Balta paused her motion. "They are not here for you." She gestured to her fellow suited Syrruk and pointed them to various positions around the ledge and doorway. "Who are they here for?" Balta half mumbled, watching the 7 warily, hand ready to whip her golden guns out upon them. Not a word was spoken by the new figures, at least not that Petrick could hear. They just moved silently to where Panzer wanted them. He wondered if their wordless communication, like how Panzer seemed to speak directly into his brain, was a function of their suits, or if the Syrruk had special abilities of some kind. Is that a thing? Balta then realized what their enigmatic host had just said, and turned to her, head cocked to the side. "Wait," she said. "What did you call me?" "Starfarer." Panzer's body language changed for a moment, and she shifted with hesitation. "Is that not the correct term?" "It is." "How'd you know that?" Panzer looked up toward the sky. "We have not the time. Please, allow me to join hands with you, and you all do the same." She stepped to the group, tucked her staff under her arm, and held out her giant gloved hands. "Is this another weird ritual thing like that blinding business in the noise chamber?" Balta asked, not having it. The group looked at her skeptically. Her 7 guards, Petrick was guessing they were guards, stood several paces away, off to the sides. Panzer again thrust her hands out to the group. "Please," she said, "I will take you to see the Seer." I'm going to take another sip. Petrick was again the first to step forward, He mimicked Panzer with her staff, nestling Clark into his armpit between his arm and his torso, and grabbed her hand. She grabbed back. Her grip was firm, but not too tight. He reached to grab Susie's hand. Susie linked up with Barry, and so on until everyone was holding hands. It occurred to Petrick that the last time they'd been connected this way, they were floating in the vacuum of space. "And where is the Seer?" Balta asked. She looked as foolish holding hands as she probably felt. "Up there." Panzer looked up again, and this time the rest of the group looked up with her. Petrick couldn't believe he had missed it before, but far up toward the bright light source was a chunk of rock that was impossibly floating in midair out toward the center of the constricting cone. A single thin strip of rock extended from inside the wall of the mountain out toward the floating platform, like a precarious bridge. It was far, far too small to have been holding up the entire platform. The Seer? No sooner had they all looked up and seen the floating rock platform than their stomachs bottomed out, and it was rushing down toward them. No, they were hurtling up toward it at incredible speed. The rock wall behind them was a blur of black, gray, and brown. The wind roared in their ears. "Crunch!" Barry moaned, his face drained of color. "I'm going to be sick." But Petrick couldn't be bothered with a sour stomach. "You can fly?" he shouted at Panzer. She looked down at him with a tight little nod, and Petrick swore he could feel a smile grow behind her inscrutable black helmet. "Do not let go of my hand," she said. The rushing feeling was incredible, greater than anything he could have imagined or dreamed. The ground below them shrank the higher they climbed. "Watch out, lady!" Balta yelled over the sound of the rushing air. Another ledge, similar, it seemed, at least from the underside, to the ledge they'd first stepped out onto, was mere feet away from them. Panzer didn't flinch. Instead, they went right toward it, through it with a loud whoosh, and continued on their way steadily upward. Petrick looked down at the platform and had just enough time as it receded to spot a small-ish diamond-shaped hole right through which they'd flown. Like it had been designed that way. Petrick realized they needn't have doubted their host's flying abilities. She was clearly used to it. "Will you slow down?" The complaint was from Barry. Petrick didn't want her to slow down. Moments later they did, but not because of any request from Balta. A final ledge in the rock wall was above them, lipping out from the mountain. It was from this last ledge that the stone bridge reached out to the Seer's floating platform. They passed through one more diamond-shaped hole that was just large enough to fit their group and hovered over the shiny floor on the top side, and Panzer gently set each of them down. Barry immediately crashed to the ground, his legs mush. "Can we not," he said between ragged breaths, "do that again?" Petrick might have laughed, but he was feeling a bit woozy himself, and he put his hands on his knees and bent over to catch his breath. "It is natural for us," Panzer said. She was looking at the children with what Petrick imagined was a mixture of confusion and amusement. "Well, it's not natural for us," Susie confirmed. "You guys know when it's too much, too fast," Barry wheezed. "Yeah, well, this is one of those times. Just give me a minute." "I will notify you next time," Panzer said with a slight incline of her head. "But we must continue. This way." And she turned her back to them once more and walked off toward the stone bridge and the floating platform. From this height, so close to the light source for the cavern, everything was bathed in brightness and almost impossible to see. Petrick had to shield his eyes to make out some vague peaked shapes. The platform of floating rock was flat, like the ledge, with what appeared to be a small set of buildings or tents on it. It was hard to make out. Haber reached for Barry, who grumbled, but he was back up on his feet in short order, and they set off to follow after their host. My apologies, it must be really dry today. Water does the body good. The thin stone bridge was wider than it had looked from so far down below on the cavern floor, but still, it had no railings. That struck Petrick first as extremely unwise, given how far down the bottom of the cavern was, and struck him second as making complete sense for a race of beings like the Syrruk. Why have railings if you can fly? "Don't look down," Susie hissed to Petrick. He saw her eyes were wide, and she shook her head. Apparently she'd made the mistake of looking down, and intended to spare Petrick from the same. Curiosity got the better of Petrick, and he peered over the railless edge anyway. The round cavern floor was so far below them it was hazy, and he immediately regretted not listening to Susie. She yanked him back from the edge, even though he was a good 3 feet from it, and shook her head. Her disdain was as much for herself as it was for Petrick. She should have known better than to even mention it to him. A few more feet, and Petrick saw that Panzer had stopped at the door of a tent-like structure that sat at the very front of the platform. It was quite unlike the buildings they'd seen down below. It peaked at the top like a mountain, and the entrance was more of a fabric flap than a door. Panzer held up her hand. "The Seer has asked to speak with the boy from Indikar," she said, pointing at Petrick. "The rest of you will wait here." "Wait a minute," said Barry, puffing out his chest. "I'm a boy from Indikar. How do you know he doesn't mean me?" "Yeah," said Susie, "and I'm a girl from Indikar. Why can't a girl talk to the Seer, huh?" "Guys," said Petrick. He put his hands up in exasperation, but Susie and Barry ignored him. Panzer looked back and forth between them, appearing even through her helmet as if she were trying to figure out what to say to the little upstarts. Balta stepped in to save her the trouble. "Best just let them in through, lady," she said to her. "Take it from me, more trouble than they're worth." Susie nodded her head in agreement. "And Haber, too." Panzer straightened. "Fine," she said, "but to enter, you each must perform another cleansing." She raised her staff, which Petrick guessed could do the trick. "Cleansing?" Balta asked. "Is that what that damn room was doing down there that nearly busted my tender ears?" Panzer stood steadfastly and began to say, "It is our custom." "Panzer!" a voice boomed from inside the tent, cutting her off. Everyone fell silent. They could see nothing inside the darkness of the tent, quite the contrast to the light-soaked bridge. Was it the Seer? It must have been the Seer. "Let them in." And that's the end of chapter 46. All right, you guys, man. 2 more chapters. That's it. Crazy. We're about to meet the Seer of Syrruk Prime. That is where we leave off. Man, really, you guys, it has been such a pleasure to do this with you guys, for you guys. I really hope that you're enjoying everything. Tomorrow will be the last day, which is crazy. But anyway, have a wonderful rest of your evening. I will be back tomorrow, same time, same place, right here on Facebook, or if you're watching this on YouTube, And yeah, we'll finish up the book. Have a wonderful evening, guys. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow.